Sometimes in the NFL, we have a couple teams that just need to let go. Oftentimes, they're teams that had a lot of success in the early 2020s or even 2010s that just can't let go at this point. And I have two teams that perfectly exemplify this problem. In today's video, I want to talk about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the New Orleans Saints. Both these teams have had moderate to a ton of success over the course of the last couple years, but now that their time has passed, these two front offices just don't know how to let go and move on and potentially rebuild. Despite both these teams having relatively decent rosters, they don't have a complete roster to overall compete. So in today's video, I want to talk about both these different teams, both their current situations, as well as how both these teams could potentially fix their problems. But without further ado, let's hop into it. And we will begin with the New Orleans Saints. Now, despite being first overall in the NFC South, I really don't believe in this New Orleans Saints team. Sure, they're 5-5 and have some pretty good victories on the year, but this is the best team in arguably the worst division in the entire NFL. And despite statistically having one of the better defenses, with the defense having really good averages in points allowed, yards allowed, touchdowns allowed, so on and so forth, the offense is really what's holding this team back. Currently, this offense ranks in the bottom half in a ton of very important offensive statistics. Statistics such as points per game, points per play, yards per play, third down conversion rate, red zone scoring rate, and of course, touchdowns per game. And with a very weird quarterback situation with Derek Carr, there doesn't really seem to be a bright future for this unit. Sure, there's some nice receivers like Chris Olave on this roster, and overall, the offensive line is one of the better units in the NFL, but overall, the offense is just kind of mediocre. And there's a couple people that need to be blamed on this one. For one, the offensive coordinator has not done a very good job for this team. Pete Carmichael has been a part of this team for many years now, and I know it would be a very hard job to get rid of the guy, but I think that it might be time. This offense feels outdated and just needs to update to modern standards. This is not 2009 where Drew Brees was out there winning Super Bowls with Pete Carmichael. This is 2023 and you have Derek Carr and a very mediocre offense. Next, I think the blame also goes to the head coach Dennis Allen. Ultimately, he is in charge of this entire team, and I just don't think he's done a very good job. I do think he's a good defensive coordinator, but not really a great offensive guy. I also think his game managing is kind of subpar as well. And of course, a lot of the blame has to go to Derek Carr. On the year, Derek Carr has 2,231 passing yards, 10 touchdowns, and 4 interceptions. And I think the best way to describe Derek Carr's current status with the New Orleans Saints would just be very mediocre. He's essentially averaging about 220 yards and 1 touchdown a game to go along with about 0.4 interceptions a game, which I'm sorry, that's just not very impressive. And despite Derek Carr being a beloved figure within the entire NFL community, I don't think he's that great of a quarterback. Despite having multiple seasons with over 4,000 yards, he's only had 1 year, which was all the way back in 2015, where he had over 30 touchdowns. And I know touchdowns don't tell the full story, but I just kind of wanted to say that I just don't think this guy is all that great. And currently, this is a Saints roster that needs a great quarterback to pull them up from where they are now. And it just so happens, this is a really good quarterback draft. Problem is, they're not going to be able to get a top-tier quarterback in this year's draft with the way they're going. They're 5-5 and will probably end the season off with 10, maybe 9 wins, which will probably be enough to make it into the playoffs, which means they're not going to have a top 16 pick. And even if you were to go down the route of trying to move up to get a quarterback, it's not like you can get off of Derek Carr's contract very easily. He's currently on a 4-year deal worth $150 million, with over $100 million of it being guaranteed. Now, I'm sure there's some ways you can get off some of that money, whether you just pay it off in bonuses or so on and so forth, but ultimately, you're paying the guy a ton of money. And, well, of course, this Saints team does not have a ton of cap space to work with. In fact, I think in order for them to actually be within the realm of having true cap space, I think they actually have to cut some people. And obviously, you're not going to cut that many players, especially if you want to continue to potentially contend for playoff spots. Now, of course, they can restructure some contracts, and I guarantee that's what they're going to end up doing. But even with the money that they're going to end up potentially saving and figuring out what to do with, they can't really sign anybody. And honestly, I feel like if they just continue doing this, they're just kind of screwing themselves over, especially in the long term. I'll be honest with you guys. I think they should just kind of bite the bullet and just be really mediocre for the next couple years to get off the cap spaces of certain players. And maybe that's kind of what their mindset is. But if that is your mindset, then why did you sign Derek Carr for that much money? I didn't understand it then. I definitely don't understand it now, because as much as people like Derek Carr, he's not that great of a quarterback. He can't win a Super Bowl. And I don't know if this Saints team felt so confident in their defense and some of their playmakers that Derek Carr would be able to get them to that next level. But Derek Carr is not going out there and beating a Jalen Hurts, a Dak Prescott, a Patrick Mahomes, a Justin Herbert, so on and so forth. He's a borderline top 15 to 20 quarterback, and that's about it. That's all he's really ever been. As for what this team can do, well, like I said, I think they kind of have to bite the bullet. You put yourself in this situation, I think you have to cut some players that might not be within your time frame, and I think you ultimately just kind of have to have some patience. Hell, I'd even try to figure out some ways to front load contracts so that you can get off these contracts in the next couple of seasons. And honestly, you just kind of have to wipe your memory of these past couple of seasons and rebuild come 2026, 27 maybe? Because honestly, there's not a lot this team can honestly do. And sure, you can fire Dennis Allen and rebuild this coaching staff to have a nice brand new one that could potentially make this team better. But ultimately, it's still the same cap space problems with the same roster problems with the same front office problems. And it's not like you can do a whole lot in the draft because your draft picks are not that great. So yeah, they're in a tough spot. I'm sorry, Saints fans. But next, we move on to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who are in a better situation, but it's still really bad. For starters, a similar story is being told as to what's going on this year. Defensively, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have been decent at times. They run an extreme bend but don't break system. They give up a ton of yards per play, a ton of third down conversions, but they rank number 1 in opponents' red zone scoring, they rank number 8 in touchdowns allowed, and they rank number 9 in opponents' points per game, despite ranking number 26 in opponents' yards per game. The problem is for this team, and again, very similar to the Saints, the offense sucks. This team ranks 23rd in yards per play and points per game. They rank 22nd in touchdowns per game, yards per game, and points per play, and they rank 28th in red zone scoring percentage. And while they have a balanced offense where they pass the ball about 60% of the time and run the ball about 40% of the time, it's not like they're very good at either one of those. When it comes to running the ball, they average 76.9 yards per game, which is the 32nd worst in the NFL, and the biggest reason why, they average 3.1 yards per rush. And passing the ball wise, it's not that much better, but it is slightly better. On the year, Baker Mayfield has 2,389 passing yards for 15 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. A very similar season to what Derek Carr is having, just some more touchdowns and more interceptions. But despite the fact that this team actually had some early success, they now sit at 4-6 and in the bottom of their division. And yeah, this division also sucks. Now, there is some positive news for this Buccaneers team and kind of where they can go for their future. Kind of similar to the Saints, they also have a terrible coaching staff that I think needs to get overhauled. They also kind of have an old school mindset. I think they need a new modern brand on that offensive coordinator room. They also have problems at the quarterback position, but fortunately, Baker Mayfield is not on a massive contract. Defensively and offensively, you do have a couple nice pieces, especially the young guys. Guys like Antoine Winfield, Tristan Wirfs, Kalijah Cansey. Of course, you still have Vita Vea. Of course, you have Devin White, so on and so forth. So there is definitely some pieces that you definitely want to keep moving forward, but this is also a unit that has some pretty old veteran players. Shaquille Barrett, Levante David, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, you kind of get my point. And usually that's okay for contending teams, but this team is not a contending team. Like I said, they're 4-6 and have been pretty bad this year. I will say if there is sort of any glimmer of hope for this team is that for the rest of the year, they have the Colts, the Panthers, the Falcons, the Packers, the Jaguars, the Saints, and the Panthers again. So that's a very winnable series of games. So potentially if they go on a bit of a winning streak, they could potentially make a playoff spot, but do you really want to? I don't know. This is a team that is probably fighting for the next contract, so I think they probably will do their best to win games. My big concern is that if this team does decide to make the playoffs this year, they're probably going to keep their same coaching staff and they might just keep Baker Mayfield. But we all know this team is never going to be good enough to make a Super Bowl with these guys. I'm not saying blow up this roster and go on a full-blown rebuild, but if I was them, I would go on a very hard reboot, if that makes sense. This is a very quarterback-loaded draft, so maybe you can potentially get a Michael Penix Jr., a Bo Nix, or one of those type of quarterbacks. And if you're unlucky and can't get one of those guys, then maybe you kind of just get a veteran quarterback like maybe a Baker Mayfield for another year and then go all in for a quarterback next year. And then just kind of move on from some of your veteran guys. Sure, if you want to get a quarterback this year, you can keep Mike Evans and Chris Godwin to be their security veteran blankets. But those guys are pretty expensive and they still have some decent draft value to them. So if you were to, let's say, hypothetically get rid of Mike Evans but keep Chris Godwin, you could potentially get a second or third, maybe even a first round pick for him. And the same thing kind of applies to some of your veterans on the defensive side of things. I'm not sure how much longer Levante David and Shaquille Barrett have, but if you could potentially trade one of those guys or maybe some of your other guys for some draft capital, I think it would also make some sense. Like I said, this is a much better situation than the New Orleans Saints because they have some cap space to work with to go along with some veterans who are tradable, and at least this team has some very good, promising young talent that is going to be around for the next couple years. I'm not saying the Saints don't have talent, but you get my point. So for the Buccaneers, I think that's kind of the game plan. I think if you follow something like that, you might be decent within the next couple seasons. So realistically, these teams are going to be bad for the next couple years. At this current point, barring a miracle, I don't think the New Orleans Saints are going to be anything relevant to a Super Bowl until likely 2026, 27 at best. Whereas I think for the Buccaneers, it might be a little bit better if they have a soft reboot or even a hard reboot this upcoming season. And if they cash out with our super nice young quarterback to go along with some nice young players in this year's and next year's draft, I think realistically, not this year, not next year, but maybe the year after that, they could be decent. Will they be championship contenders? Not unless their quarterback is the second coming of Tom Brady. But if they can get a young quarterback, like I said, like a Michael Penix Jr., and he somehow works out to be a really good quarterback, then hey, maybe they could contend that year. But I do think that is extremely unlikely, and I think we have to be realistic with our current expectations. So Saints fans and Buccaneers fans, I'm sorry I had to out you guys out like this, but your teams look really bleak right now. And at this point, I don't really know if you guys should go into rebuilds, and even if you can go in rebuilds, how successful they will be. I like both these franchises, and I like both these fan bases. They are extremely loyal and have been great franchises for many years, but hey, sometimes things just don't go your way. But hopefully you guys did enjoy this video. If you guys did, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button because it helps me out an absolute ton. But I love you guys. Peace.